Hi all, so today I would like to talk about the first steps of Frederick I of Hohenstaufen as sovereign of Germany. And it seems a rather, narrow chapter of the history of this king, so we're talking essentially about the first 2 years of reign from 1152 to 54. So essentially before his first Romfahrt, or the Italian expedition that brought to his imperial crowning. 2 years, however, that are important to see what were the goals of Frederick in German politics, and especially trying to understand the greatness of this medieval figure from his very and the very beginning of his rule. He was 30 when he was elected king of Germany, so he was quite young, and this figure Frederick I is probably definitely one of the most important in the Western Middle Ages as figure, and what he did in his reign is definitely a very important key of reading um, for the whole politics of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Also because, as we will see, there are also controversial aspects of this, not meaning to criticize the greatness of this figure, but for instance, he's being criticized with the fact that he invested too many resources in his Mediterranean policy, um, and by trying to recover the lands of the Italic kingdom, while he could have spent the same resources to create um, a centralized monarchy, a national monarchy like the ones of France and England into Germany, while essentially as you know, this wouldn't happen. Germany would basically explode into a myriad of many little states, let's say, in a very inappropriate uh, term, um, and essentially we have to wait for the second half of the 19th century to see Germany united. And therefore it's very important to look at his politics, as his policy both in Germany and in Italy, and I think in this sense that his German policies are often overlooked, because obviously the greater effort that Frederick Barbarossa did in his reign was this struggle against the Lombard League and other Italian cities that basically resisted to the reappropriation of certain royal prerogatives that by the imperial right were indeed rightfully in fact uh, belonging to Frederick, and this would make it seem like it was the most important thing. But also German policy is very important, and also because the policy that Frederick carried out in the German lands was important for the same development of Germany, in spite of these controversy regarding the failure in the construction of a German national monarchy. And the very first steps, once that he was elected, um, were in fact relative to the German politics. This might sound banal, because it's obvious that the first concern of a German king elected in a moment like this, we're talking about the mid of the 12th century, um, would be always to look at very carefully at the German political landscape in order to to start effectively a new policy, a new imperial policy. And this is very meaningful because in spite of the progressive strengthening of the Hohenstaufen rule with Conrad III, that was Frederick's uncle and who had reigned before him, and the consequential stability of the royal rule after the struggle for the investitures that had basically brought to an end the Salian the power of the Salian dynasty. The German crown wasn't definitely the German kingdom wasn't that unitary or stable unit, politically speaking, and it was still very much fragmented. And Frederick, as many other kings before and after him, would have necessarily to obtain the endorsement of the high German nobility, whether it was lay or ecclesiastical. As Germany is famous also during the Middle Ages, among the other things, for having these very powerful ecclesiastical princes that were basically, for lifestyle and ambitions, definitely not much different to the lay ones. They owned armies, they were extremely influential, and they also ruled, especially on very powerful lands of Germany. This support that Frederick had to get obviously passed through the concession of certain privileges. This is how it basically happened. It was always an exchange, like, I don't know, I grant you these rights over that land, but you have to be faithful to me, because otherwise I'm gonna take them back. And since royal power was not that strong, this obviously complicated the situation, because even for rising to power, very often the monarch who wanted obviously to rule and to strengthen the his own situation, had automatically to put into account the idea of giving away certain rights and certain money. In fact, it was all traded this way, and we don't have to be surprised. The whole politics, function essentially the same way today as in those times, with the only difference that maybe in those times the absence of a coercive power from a centralized authority obviously made these deals happening relatively under the sunlight, and they reflected this way the weaknesses of these political institutions. However, we're talking about Frederick Barbarossa, so a man who really stands out as one of the greatest monarchs of the medieval world. And in fact, by granting these privileges, he was quite serious in pretending, obviously, the loyalty of the German nobility in exchange. And he would at that point use an iron fist against all those who opposed him, because this is what is in the mind of Frederick, and we can't say it was just his own character, temper, that definitely helped into carrying out very energetically these policies, but it was a tradition existing, especially north of the Alps, in the conception that the emperor had, and a very he was essentially the hand of God, and it's not surprised that since the Carolingian times, the imperial power that these German dynasts were embodying would be conceived, especially under the being inspired by the God of the Old Testament and his relatively to his wrath and his fury, his ability to crush the enemies and into battle, and therefore reviving even the Germanic warrior ethics that even in the 12th century were all but extinguished, and in fact would be represented by this aristocracy from which the same Frederick had risen. So the idea of waging war at that point as a king of Germany, he's not emperor yet, he's king of the Romans, because that was the title that was given. So it was a sort of pre-imperial authority that he was given. He would become emperor only when crowned by the Pope in Rome, but let's say that in order to be crowned he had to be not just king of Germany, but also he had to be crowned as king of the Romans. And this was a sort of political it was a political passage that worked as a litmus, in a sense, and as a litmus test for seeing, if this German monarch had enough political support from the local nobility. And Frederick was standing out in this sense as a very warlike and very firm and authoritarian monarch, which he showed with his arms, not harms. Also harms, because he definitely did a lot of harm to those who didn't obey him. And it was a bit of a novelty in the German world at that point, because theoretically, the German aristocracy had been used to elect weak candidates. The German monarchy was elective. It was a Germanic tradition, essentially, that came from this, and it reflected the fact that Germany had never seen the structuration, the building, the construction of a centralized authority, a centralized rule that could be transversal to all the various political powers that existed, especially on regional scale, or better, provincial scale, and that in practice held the real power in Germany, and obviously, however, making it very weak overall, because they were divided and they would pursue their own policy. Frederick was exactly the opposite. He stands out in German history, in medieval history in general, as a leader who tried to instead to reverse this trend that was not typical just of Germany. It's something that you find in part also in certain Slavic countries, especially in all those societies where there was a sort of egalitarian approach to kingship, in the sense that it wasn't much of a dynasty that had the right of ruling, but it was the local aristocracy who had to elect and therefore to legitimate formally and factually a sovereign. And Frederick, in this sense, is an amazing figure, because he worked really. He lived a long life, who, by the way, ended by unnatural causes. By the way, it would have been interesting to see Frederick living a bit more rather than dying into a stream in Asia Minor. But he still lived a very long journey here on Earth, and he is one of those sovereigns that really started, a very patient work since his youth, to build step by step something something great. And in this case, probably things failed, and there were many factors for which this happened. And this doesn't take away any merits, considering his energy, the energy and the efforts that he put in achieving this. And, and it's very interesting because these kind of monarchs are kind of underestimated. We had, even in our history, Alexander the Great really changed the whole mindset of European Western culture. The idea that of a young, very young, brave, almost to foolishness, general and king who would die young, undefeated, with this great exploit, etc. And therefore we tend to prize this kind of very bold young guys who die early and make heroic deeds. But there are also a lot of great sovereigns who really started it, maybe not as Alexander, but as his father, Philip II of Macedon, who started from from their youth, and then progressing along the age in and pursuing an objective with great faith, with great patience, and great method. Well, definitely Frederick belonged more to the second model, though he was a very brave fighter and warrior as well. Like, I can't say like Alexander did, but we shouldn't underestimate the individual valor of these of the knights and of the aristocracy that made them up. And this all for saying that Frederick used basically all the powers he got in order to make the German aristocracy helping him in his task. He began obviously also rather than just with the sword, also with a great number of councils that we call the diets, the Reichstag in German, that were these normal assemblies that in fact would represent, in which all the German stands would be represented, and in practice the main political figures of Germany. And therefore they reflected this idea that every imperial or royal decision had to be approved by the rest of the aristocracy, and it was the natural place for a diplomatical thought, for for political debate, and Frederick really did pass from that. The German Diet is kind of the symbol of the German monarchy itself in many ways, and of its civil progress, because obviously the diets became increasingly more complex during the centuries. And a work like the one of Frederick really maybe set an important premise for this, because obviously the diet wouldn't be wouldn't be called if the aristocracy didn't care anything about the king. And Frederick in this sense was not the puppet king that the Germans wished. He was a very impositive sovereign who demanded authority, the obeying of the law, and that his orders would be carried out. Coming back on the sword, he definitely proceeded very steadily against those unloyal vassals, with confiscations of land, and this was a very important process, because the Germans were quite squared already at that time. They, if you don't obey to me, I raise you to the ground, because I'm the the sovereign ruler, and chosen by God. God gave me this temporal power you have to obey to me. If you don't obey me at my request, just wait for my strength to enter into an action. And this was really a normal praxis into medieval Europe. You know, you can't really see that as the functioning of a German system only. You know, it was the a structural datum of, you know, the political and military dialectics to constantly fight against your opponents. But Frederick exploited particularly these confiscations in order to build something more than just, you know, acquiring land for his own family like another prince or vassal would have done. Because he, by confiscating the rebels' lands, he would entrust them to certain administrators of servile origin, the so-called ministeriales in Latin, who are a characteristics of medieval Germany, a very interesting class, we can say. And who were these guys? You know, essentially the ministeriales is a term that is broadly used since the early Middle Ages to define a sort of administrator. In fact, ministerium has also obviously the same etymology of administration, etc. And normally they would be normal, you know, civil administrators drawn from the aristocrat aristocratic clients and stuff. In Germany, however, they assume in the low Middle Ages a very different role from the usual, and it's a very characteristic one for Germany, as we were saying, because these guys were they were serfs, they were not freemen. And this was very important because the Germans throughout Frederick I had been trying, you know, well, we should make some premises here, but I try to make it more simple. Let's say better that Frederick was building up a feudal system in Germany. Germany didn't have a feudal system proper. They had obviously inherited the Carolingian vassalatic beneficiary system, but it was a much lighter and simple form compared to the one that had developed in France, that was model of feudal Europe, with very strong ties to, you know, of very powerful nobles to the king. And the reason was that Germany lacked the extensive estates that were present in Germany and concentrated in the hands of a very few nobles. So Frederick looked favorably at the French feudal model because it was a very good mean to rise to create a class of knights who could be loyal to the king and could be maintained by, you know, these great quantities of land. So from one side, Frederick's policy was to import French feudalism into Germany, and that really changed the shape of Germany. By the 13th century, essentially, German cavalry was, I can't say equal to the French one, but they were starting to become at the same level, and this began with Frederick, even though probably there were certain socio-economical premises that we can't talk about. But it was a great problem that you couldn't trust a very very large quantity of land to a nobleman, and that you would tie that noble formally to your royal power and demanding his loyalty to you. But the problem is that that guy is essentially given decentralized power, so that at a certain point he can become even particularly dangerous for you. So the ministeriales appear in this process because the ministeriales were not freemen. So they technically belonged to the nobles, so freemen of course, who could use them in the place of vassals and minor vassals, by essentially entrusting them those certain fiefs without the juridical recognition that was proper of a free vassal, meaning that the ministeriales would become de facto noble themselves through this immense power that they were able to receive from the king, but they wouldn't be juridically recognized as owners of those lands. Then in political practice this really happened because it's not that if you're not a free man but you're given that great power, you don't use that power. There is a supreme judge from who knows where that says no, you're not freeman, so those land do not belong to you, so we have to take it back. They would de facto have the same power of the same vassals, and there was, however, this minimal fealty that became from having been entrusted those very properties by the king. And this could work, in fact, very well at the beginning, while why? Because the ministeriales, originally speaking, were poor, or at least they weren't so rich like the other feudal lords. And the fact that a king like Frederick would entrust them certain land obviously would make them very tied to the king, as long as they would be surrounded by other hostile noblemen who instead could pursue more autonomous policies. And another very interesting aspect of these ministeriales in Germany is that they had a chivalric dignity, meaning that they were practically knights. And in fact, the German knights around the 13th century, especially in southern Germany, seemingly were by 90% ministeriales. So, for telling how largely this new class had expanded in those centuries. The first ministeriales are witnessed, historically speaking, since the Salian dynasty, from the time of Conrad II, but it was definitely under the Hohenstaufen that they grew very much in power, and exactly for the reasons that I have been trying to explain. And they soon, however, the ministeriales would soon learn how to live and behave as great lords, also because they were, in fact, many ministeriales eventually became wealthier, even of the same free feudal lords. And they would start making up a sort of aristocracy on their own and taking up the power in certain lands that remained without a chief, for instance, like in Austria, seemingly. Southern Germany especially saw the rise of this class. And this happened also thanks to the fact, that the southern Germany was the area where the Hohenstaufen, in fact, had mostly operated, for reasons that we will be seeing in a short while. And the new ministerial nobility was extremely faithful to Frederick, so this was a very clever move, and they obviously supported him because, as we have said, they knew that their prestige and power derived essentially from the king's favor. This is something that in part happened also with the ecclesiastical princes, in both ways, telling the truth, because first of all, the ecclesiastical princes seemingly made a very extensive use of ministeriales, but more importantly, at higher levels, the ecclesiastical princes were more faithful to imperial rule, because they knew that their institutional role was much more granted by a royal authority, who, however, couldn't enter by right in their own lands, than the one of the rest of German the rest of German nobility, as basically it would be evident at the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, when the royal authority collapsed, and many lay German princes began to even fight and invade to fight the ecclesiastical princes and to invade even their lands. So the church, in this sense, tended to favor Frederick, and if you look at the armies that he led into Italy, most of the feudal levies that Frederick was able to rise were in fact they came in fact from the ecclesiastical estates. Exactly for this reason. Instead, the rest of German nobility would kind of desert in certain circumstances. Even the greatest defeat on Italian soil by Frederick actually was caused by the absence of the Saxon reinforcements. However, it should be pointed out under this point of view that it was already from some time in Germany that the traditional feudal levies that the various German princes owed to the king for the military expeditions were had been already commutated with monetary contributions. So the German aristocracy was never interested in the Italian journeys of the Roman emperors, and they preferred to mind their own business in Germany. But in fact, the older Roman emperors had, broader horizons, and therefore needed an army to carry out their own universalistic policies. And sometimes, however, we stressed the military role of the Ministeriales, who became a class of knights within the early Roman Empire. However, certain Ministeriales in Germany maintained their eminently civil roles of local administrators of lands, maybe to build a certain property and to strengthen the power of the German crown and of the Hohenstaufen dynasty that way. By the way, there isn't just, in fact, taking the enemy lands and acquiring power that way. A big deal of the same power that Frederick had in his own times derived from the very hard work that especially his father made for him by building a lot of castles in the Swabian lands, and in structuring this base from which eventually Frederick started in practice. So as you see, it's a policy that plays on various levels. And they were quite intermingled policies as well, and therefore from this you see that there is a territorial construction of Frederick from these very years of his German government that is concentrated especially in the area between the Alps, the Rhine, and the Lake of Constance. So essentially in southwestern Germany. And we can't talk about a continuous territorial entity as always in this period. These were all essentially a sum of many different lands that were that had in common just the rule of the owner, and wouldn't make compact, continuous entity on the map. If you look, I don't know if you ever looked at a map of Germany or any other Western kingdom at this time, and looking, how the various feudal properties would be actually scattered, and it's a mess. We have, even cartographically and historically speaking, a very great difficulty in drawing these such maps. But it's still, what remains interesting, however, is the area. So we see the Alps and the Lake of Constance. So essentially those lands that would be crucial for starting an Italian campaign, because obviously Germany is just bordering Italy at that time, and also the Rhine, which was always the most developed area in Germany from an economical point of view, and a very important mean of communication with the North Sea, for trade with England, the Scandinavian countries, Flanders, especially wealthy Flanders. And therefore areas that were obviously also chosen because Swabia is essentially there. Swabia is between the Rhine and the Alps, so those would be native lands of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and would start from there. And it's not surprised that the greater enemy of Frederick, his cousin Henry the Lion, was Duke of Saxony, which is an area that is wholly in another place. It's in the north. It's in the north of Germany. And this is important also to consider the distances, the spatial dimensions of these phenomena, because just think about the logistical problems of waging a war throughout all these, first of all with the technology of that time, but also considering the various, territorial contiguities of certain estates and areas of political influence, etc. And this area that the Hohenstaufen built would be crucial for the dynasty's future policy, because, as Frederick had understood, without territorial and economical base, or at least a sufficiently territorial and economical base, he could have not make it to exercise any true power in Germany. And this is in fact the main element of that you have to consider when looking especially at the situation of Germany, that had this very fragmented political asset. Because until you say, I don't know, the Norman kingdoms of England or Sicily, those were pretty unitary dominions for that time. Yeah, sure, there were barons who would fight against the central authority, but at least it was easier to manage things overall. Germany in this sense was a mess, and if you wanted to play hard, you had to have an art base in there. So castle by castle you had to build it up, and when you start looking at German politics, you realize that indeed the guys who played the political game in Germany, and the main players were essentially the ones who had the more extensive territorial dominions, and that's pretty obvious. And this happened in 2 years before Frederick went into his first Italian expedition, and that tells you how determined this guy was, and how important for him were the imperial authority and the idea of reorganizing the empire, really, from a juridical point of view, from a political point of view, from a military point of view, all things that he started to do. And I don't think only because, he was in fact the emperor. So, well, it's pretty obvious that if he had been, an opposer of the royal power, he would have acted differently. But we shouldn't think that these emperors didn't conceive their prerogatives by law. Especially Frederick was someone who really showed to be wanted to put an order to the kingdom. He worked with the Italian jurists. He, as we've seen, he sought to engage all the political establishment of Germany in this broader universal policy. He really believed in his own authority, and he really believed that he was chosen by God to do that, and we should never forget such things. And rationalizing too much when thinking about especially these times, which doesn't mean that these weren't rational people, but there were reasons for which they would act that were fueled partly also by ideologies, and this is a bit how it happens all over history. Always minding that those ideologies could be supported because there were political and social bases that would require those same ideologies to stand, and this is very important when studying the history of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, because they were essentially the apogee of the Western medieval civilization as imperial rulers, and what they were doing wasn't just pursuing a private family affair, essentially a business that would just benefit their personal prestige, but they really felt to be in charge in re-establishing the Roman Empire and giving an asset to this world, for which they had to answer God from their perspective. So what happened after them was also world changing from an ideological point of view. And we will see that better, especially when studying the Frederick's campaigns in Italy, where things had started to take another path compared to the rest of Europe. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I know there are many of you who like the orange stuff, and I like them too very much. So I hope I satisfied at least some of your curiosities. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did so, please share it or subscribe to my channel to receive further contents. Otherwise, just leave a like. And if you have any question, please comment or send me an email, and I will be happy to answer you. And as always, I thank you again for the attention, and I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.